Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Forgotten Room. Ellen turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The familiar creak of hinges filled the air, a sound that had become a quiet comfort over the past few months. The house was quiet, just as it always was when she returned from work. The silence, however, never seemed to be complete. It was as if the house was waiting for her to do something, to notice something out of place. She had moved into her grandmother's house 6 months ago, a sprawling, old Victorian tucked on the outskirts of town. It was a place full of characterful ceilings, stained glass windows, and creaky wooden floors that had long ago surrendered to the weight of time. She'd inherited it after her grandmother's sudden passing. Though she hadn't known much about the house's past, her grandmother had kept things close to the chest, never speaking much of the house's history. Ellen's parents had wanted her to sell the house and move closer to them, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving it behind. The house was part of her heritage, part of who she was. It was also the one place where she could escape the constant hum of the modern world, her overstressed job, and the endless demands of others. She had come to the house with hopes of starting over, finding peace. But peace was a fragile thing. That morning, as Ellen prepared to leave for work, she had noticed something strange. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. As she passed through the hallway toward the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, something that didn't belong, a door she had never seen before. At first, she had thought it was her imagination, a trick of light and shadow, but when she looked again, it was unmistakable, a narrow door tucked away at the far end of the hallway, behind a tall bookshelf she had rearranged only a week before. Ellen had lived in the house for 6 months and had walked this hallway countless times. She was sure there had been no door there before. After work that evening, Ellen couldn't shake the thought of the door. It lingered in her mind like an itch that couldn't be scratched. She had to investigate. Something inside her urged her to find out more, to uncover what lay hidden behind it. She went to the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate. The house felt colder than usual tonight, the air still and heavy. She stared at the narrow door, which appeared to be an old wooden panel, worn with age and time. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a faint seam along the edges where the door met the wall. It seemed almost seamless, as if it had been built into the house itself. With a deep breath, Ellen reached out, her fingers grazing the cold surface. The moment her skin touched the door, a strange sensation washed over her, as if the house itself had inhaled sharply, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, unsure of why she felt the way she did. A soft click broke the stillness as the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. The room was far smaller than she had expected, its walls lined with shelves that were nearly empty, save for a few old boxes and dust-covered trinkets. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellowish glow over the space. The air smelled musty, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. Ellen stepped inside, her heart racing. She didn't know why, but the room felt wrong, like a secret that had been buried for far too long. Her footsteps echoed against the bare walls, and she instinctively reached out to touch one of the boxes stacked haphazardly on a shelf. The lid creaked open under her fingers, revealing yellowing papers and old, brittle photographs. The images were of people she didn't recognize, their faces blurred by time. There were no names, no dates, nothing to explain who they were, just strangers, their lives captured in silence, frozen in time. As she moved through the room, she noticed more boxes stacked against the far wall, some open, others sealed tightly. One of the boxes, however, caught her attention. It was made of dark wood, different from the others, with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. She couldn't explain why, but the sight of it made her heart race. Against her better judgment, she opened it. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. Ellen picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded it, revealing a series of handwritten words. The handwriting was elegant, almost ornate, but the message was chilling. Do not open the door. It is not meant to be seen. Ellen frowned. She looked back at the narrow door she had just opened, and for the first time since she had moved in, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. What was behind that door? Who had left the note? And why had they warned her? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ellen couldn't stop thinking about the note, the room, and the strange feeling that had settled deep in her bones. She spent hours pacing the house, trying to make sense of it all, but the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Who had built the room, and why? Why had her grandmother never mentioned it? and why no one in the family ever talked about this part of the house. The next morning, Ellen decided to search through her grandmother's old things. She needed answers. In the attic, she found dusty boxes of old belongings, clothes, furniture, and books, all packed away for years. But there was nothing that stood out. No letters, no records, no journals that might explain the history of the room. Everything seemed to blend together, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, at the very bottom of one of the boxes, she found something that caught her eye, an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of use. Ellen opened it carefully, flipping through the pages, until she came to a section near the back, where the writing became more erratic, almost frantic. The entries were dated back to the 1960s. The last one dated just a few months before her grandmother's death. The handwriting grew increasingly disjointed, as if her grandmother had been struggling to write something important. One entry caught Ellen's attention. "I cannot stay here much longer. The house remembers too much. The room calls to me." Ellen's heart skipped a beat. What room was her grandmother referring to? The words seemed to drip with fear, as if her grandmother had been haunted by something she couldn't escape. She read on. "I fear I've made a mistake. What I found in that room cannot be unseen. If I could turn back, I would, but I fear the door will open again, and when it does, it will not be me who answers." Ellen's stomach twisted into a knot. She could feel the weight of the words in the pit of her stomach. What had her grandmother discovered, and why hadn't she told anyone about it? The journal didn't offer any further explanation, but Ellen knew one thing. The forgotten room was no mere curiosity. It was a place of secrets, of something dark that had been hidden away for decades. And whatever it was still waiting for her. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. The weight of the journal's words haunted her. She could still feel the chill in the air around the door, the strange pull it had on her. It was as if the room itself was alive, calling to her, urging her to return. She tried to resist the urge to go back, to shut the door and leave it alone. But as the hours dragged on, she knew she couldn't. The answers were there, behind that door, and she couldn't walk away until she knew what they were. With a deep breath, she stood up and walked down the hallway. The house was still, silent. As she passed the living room, the dim light from the hallway illuminated the closed door at the end of the hall. She stood before it once more, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handle. The door opened with a soft creak, and Ellen stepped inside. But this time, the room was different. The air was thick with something else, something far darker. The shelves were no longer empty, but crowded with objects of books, photographs, and strange trinkets she couldn't name. And in the far corner of the room, beneath a heavy tarp, something was moving. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. The room was alive with a terrible energy, and as she stepped forward, she knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The truth was waiting for her, hidden in the forgotten room. Given the length and complexity of your request, providing a full 15,000 word part in a single message would not be feasible. However, I can continue from where I left off and provide the continuation of part 2 of The Forgotten Room. This will maintain the narrative's tone, character development, and mounting tension. Ellen stood frowning, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room before her had changed, warped into something more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The once dusty shelves were now crowded with objects, their arrangement strange and unnatural. Books that hadn't been there before were piled high, their leather covers old but gleaming faintly in the dim light. Photographs were scattered across the floor, some torn and faded, others almost too clear to be real. And in the corner, under a tattered tarp, something shifted. Ellen's heart skipped a beat. The atmosphere in the room was thick, oppressive, and heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she took a tentative step forward, drawn to the corner where the tarp bulged as though something was moving beneath it. She didn't know why she didn't turn and run. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, a strange pull that hurt her to see what lay hidden under the fabric. Her fingers brushed the tarp, and she yanked it back in one swift motion. There was nothing underneath but an old, cracked mirror, its surface obscured by layers of dust. But as Ellen stared at the mirror, she saw something strange. For a brief moment, the reflection was distorted, and she swore she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. Her pulse raced, and she spun around, but the room was empty. The chill in the air seemed to freeze her in place. The mirror's surface was perfectly still now, reflecting only her pale face. She exhaled sharply, trying to calm herself. It was nothing, just a trick of the light, but the feeling of unease lingered, crawling beneath her skin. Ellen took a step back, eyeing the shelves once more. The objects seemed to call to her, each one more peculiar than the last. She picked up an old book from one of the shelves, its pages yellowed and brittle. The title was in a language she didn't recognize, but there was a sense of urgency in the way the pages fluttered under her fingers, almost as if the book were alive. She quickly placed it back, the uneasy feeling growing with every passing second. Something was wrong with this room. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. As she moved to the far side of the room, Ellen's eyes landed on an area of the wall that was slightly different from the others. There were faint, marked scratches, perhaps etched into the wood. The markings appeared to form some sort of pattern, or maybe they were words. Her eyes squinted in an attempt to decipher them, but they were too faint to be legible. Curiosity gnawed at her. She had to know what it said. Ellen knelt down, brushing away the layers of dust that had accumulated over the years, her fingers trembling as she traced the scratches. They seemed to spiral in on themselves, like a maze. She pressed harder, and to her shock, a faint scraping sound echoed through the room. It was as though the wall itself had reacted to her touch. The air around her thickened. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something behind the wall was trying to break through. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to remain still, frowning, trying to listen. The noises weren't just random. They were deliberate, rhythmic, as though they were calling her. Suddenly, the noise stopped. An eerie silence fell over the room, and the only sound left was her own breathing, shallow and quick. Ellen stood up, backing away from the wall. She had to leave, had to get out. This place was consuming her, pulling her deeper into something she wasn't prepared to understand. But as her eyes darted around the room, she noticed something new, a small, intricately carved box on one of the shelves, one she hadn't seen before. It was made of the same dark wood as the strange box from before. This one, however, had a brass latch, gleaming in the dim light. Ellen reached out slowly, almost as if compelled. She unlatched the box, her hands trembling, and opened it. Inside, there was a letter rolled and yellowed with age. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and written in a hurried script. Ellen's heart raced as she read. The door must remain closed. What was uncovered cannot be undone. The room's memory is long. Those who enter will never leave unchanged. The words sent a chill through her spine. The room's memory. What was this letter trying to say? The door, had it always been there? Had her grandmother known about it, and who had left this warning? Ellen's mind swirled with questions, but before she could process any of them, a loud bang echoed through the room, making her jump. The door behind her slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Her heart stopped. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The door that had been open was now closed, locked. She moved toward it, pulling at the handle with frantic force, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her again, but this time, it was worse as something was wrong. Her surroundings began to warp. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally. The light flickered and dimmed, casting strange, contorted shapes on the walls. And then, she heard it. A soft whisper, a voice barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere within the walls. Get out now. Ellen frowned. She didn't know what to do. The voice, though faint, was clear. She wasn't alone. Ellen stumbled backward, her legs weak and unsteady. She could hear the whispers now, louder, more insistent. They weren't just coming from the walls, they were coming from everywhere, all around her. Leave this place. You're not meant to know. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. No one, just the creeping darkness closing in. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. Every breath felt like a struggle. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she pressed her hands against the door, willing it to open, but it remained stubbornly shut. She had to get out. There was something here, something watching her, waiting. The whispering grew louder. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her hands pressed to her ears, desperate to block out the voices that filled her head. You have to leave. The door is the only way out. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The whisper ceased. The room grew still once more, but it wasn't the same as before. It was as though the house had exhaled, releasing a breath it had been holding for years. Ellen didn't wait another second. She grabbed the latch again, pulling with all her strength. This time, the door gave way, creaking open just enough for her to slip through. The moment she stepped out of the room, the air felt lighter, fresher, but the sense of unease, of something lingering just beyond her reach, remained. She hurried back to the main part of the house, but when she turned to look behind her, she saw it. The door was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Ellen's mind was racing as she fled from the room. Her hands shook as she gripped the banister, her feet stumbling over the worn wooden steps as she made her way down the hallway. She couldn't remember how long she'd been in the room, but it felt like hours in eternity. The house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt alien, hostile. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed loud, too deliberate. The once familiar scent of old wood and dust now carried a strange, acrid tang. The silence, which had always been comforting, now pressed against her like a physical weight. She needed answers. She couldn't just leave it all behind. She had to know what the room was, why it had appeared, and why it felt as though it had always been there. The door had disappeared as if it had never existed, and yet Ellen knew she hadn't imagined it. She had seen it, touched it, and something had been inside it. But what? As she entered the living room, Ellen paused, her eyes scanning the shelves for something, anything that might give her a clue. Her grandmother's things, the objects that had once seemed like comforting relics, now felt like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle she couldn't complete. The house had secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. The journal had been her only lead so far. She had to go back to it. Ellen climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her mind consumed with the thought of the journal. Her grandmother's last entries were a cryptic warning, and Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than just words on a page. Something was happening in this house, something beyond the natural, beyond the logical. The attic was as she had left it, bathed in the pale light of the late afternoon sun that filtered through the small, dusty window. She approached the box where the journal had been, heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the house's history seemed to press down on her, and she couldn't help but feel as though she were being watched. As her fingers brushed against the familiar leather cover, she pulled the journal out and opened it to the last few pages, skimming through the handwritten entries. There were more, many more, than she had seen before. It was as if her grandmother had been writing feverishly, trying to record something before it was too late. Ellen read aloud to herself. It's no longer just the room. It's the house itself. It moves when you're not looking. It watches when you sleep. And it remembers. The door is only a part of it. The house has been awake for a long time, and now it wants something more. The words sent a chill down Ellen's spine. She could feel the presence of the house in her bones, as though it were alive, breathing, aware of her every move. Her grandmother had written this. Had she known what was going to happen? Had she felt the strange pull of the house, the room? The next entry was even more disturbing. I've begun to hear things, whispers at night, soft murmurs in the walls. But they're not just whispers, they're voices. They speak my name. They tell me to open the door again, to let them in. But I won't. I refuse to. They are not what they seem. They are not what they were. They are something older, something far more dangerous. Ellen felt her stomach drop. Her grandmother had written this just before she passed. Had she been trying to warn her? But about what? Ellen's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a loud thud from downstairs. She frowned, the journal slipping from her hands as it fell to the floor with a soft thump. For a moment, she didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat. The house had been eerily quiet since she had returned from the forgotten room. But now no, there was a sound that was impossible to ignore. She rushed downstairs, her heart thudding in her chest. As she approached the hallway, she saw it, the door, the narrow door she had opened just days before, now standing once again at the end of the hall. It was there, and it was waiting. Her pulse quickened. Ellen's feet carried her toward the door before she could stop herself, her mind screaming at her to turn back. But she didn't. She couldn't. She stood before it, her hand trembling as it reached for the handle. The moment she touched it, the door seemed to breathe, a soft groan escaping the wood, as if it had been waiting for all this time. Ellen hesitated, her fingers still resting on the cold brass. It wasn't just a door. It was a portal, a gateway to something she wasn't prepared to face. But she had to know. She had to understand what was behind it. She turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was the same, yet it wasn't. The air was thick with a pungent odor, like something was rotting just out of sight. The walls were no longer empty, but adorned with strange markings, symbols that Ellen couldn't recognize. They seemed to writhe, to move in the dim light, as if they were alive. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, beneath the same tarp, something was stirring. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The tarp was slowly rising, as if something underneath it was pushing against it from within. The shape that emerged was dark, undefined, and seemed to shimmer with a strange, unnatural energy. A form began to take shape, a figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch afar, as if it were made of shadows, not flesh. The figure stepped forward, and with it, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The very air itself seemed to recoil in fear. The figure spoke, its voice low and distorted, barely a whisper that seemed to resonate deep within her skull. "You should never have opened the door. You should never have come back." Ellen's heart raced. The voice knew it. Somehow, it was familiar, like an echo of something she had once heard, a memory from her childhood. "Who are you? What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, a long, skeletal hand stretching toward her, its fingers curling like tendrils of smoke. Ellen stepped back, her instinct screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. Her legs were frown-seeing, her body unwilling to obey. And then, just as the figure was about to touch her, the lights flickered and the air around her seemed to implode. The world spun out of control, and Ellen felt herself falling into darkness. Ellen awoke to darkness. She couldn't remember when she had fallen unconscious, but the air was cold, much colder than it had been before. The room was now silent, eerily so, and she could feel the weight of something watching her. Her head throbbed as she sat up, her hands trembling as they reached for her surroundings. She was no longer in the room. She was back in the hallway, sprawled on the floor, the door standing before her, closed once more. The figure, the shadow, it was gone. But something was different. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though they were alive. The shadows at the edges of the hallway stretched unnaturally, reaching out toward her, and in the distance, faintly, she could hear the whispering again, the same voices, the same words. "Leave this house. It will never let you go." Ellen stood shakily, her body weak and her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She had to get out. She had to leave this place before it consumed her too. But as she turned toward the door to the outside world, she saw something that frowned her in place. In a mirror by the hallway, her reflection was smiling back at her, but it wasn't her smile. It was something else. Ellen's reflection in the mirror smiled wider, its lips stretching in a grotesque imitation of joy. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched herself, other version of herself, stare back. Eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger, she stumbled backward, her legs weak, her head spinning as the mirror seemed to distort further. Her reflection began to move independently, jerking with unsettling speed as though trying to escape the boundaries of the glass. In a panic, she turned away from the mirror, but the voice that had been whispering from the darkness returned, louder now, as if from every corner of the house. "You can't escape. It's too late." Ellen's pulse hammered in her chest, but the voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It had become a command. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the door, her heart racing in her throat. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this nightmare. She couldn't stay here any longer. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, as if the house itself had invited her to flee. But the hallway she entered was not the same one she remembered. The walls were slick with a dark, wet substance, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as if the house were alive, groaning in pain. "You cannot leave." The voice wasn't in her mind this time. It was coming from all around her. The walls, the floors, the air itself seemed to breathe with it. Ellen's legs felt like lead as she stumbled down the corridor, the sound of her own footsteps mocking her every movement. She turned, searching for an exit, but the hallway stretched longer than it should have, twisting and bending into unnatural shapes. It was as though the house was alive, shifting around her, trapping her. Her grandmother's voice, or what she imagined to be her grandmother's voice, echoed in her ears. "The house has memory, and it will never forget." A shudder ran down her spine. The realization hit her with suffocating force that this house had been waiting for her. The memories it held were not of the past, but of something deeper, something darker that went beyond her grandmother's warnings. Ellen's eyes darted toward a far corner of the hallway. There, in the distance, she saw his door, the one she had just fled from moments ago. But this time, it wasn't just standing there waiting for her. It was calling to her. Its presence was an inescapable pressure, a magnet pulling her toward it. She moved forward, her legs carrying her unwillingly toward it, despite every fiber of her being telling her to run. As she neared, she could feel the temperature drop further. It was like stepping into an ice-cold tomb. The air around her was thick, almost suffocating, as if the room behind the door were filled with something that didn't belong. When she reached for the handle, her hand trembled, yet when she touched it, it felt strangely familiar. The moment her skin made contact with the brass, the air seemed to pulse with energy, and the house groaned in response, as if it had been waiting for her. The door opened with a loud creak, the hinges protesting. What lay behind it was no longer a simple forgotten room. It was a place where time and space twisted, where reality itself seemed to splinter. Ellen stepped through, her breath caught in her throat. The room had become something else entirely, a nightmare made real. The walls were lined with strange, shifting symbols, written in a language she couldn't understand. The floor was covered in a thick layer of ash, black as night, and it crunched underfoot with every step she took. The light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with malicious intent. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in that oppressive silence. Her hand reached for the wall, seeking something solid, but instead, it passed through the surface. As though the wall were made of fog, her heart skipped a beat as she pulled her hand back, staring at the space she had just touched. Then, something shifted behind her. She spun around. The figure was standing in the corner. It was tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows, its features hidden beneath a veil of darkness. But Ellen knew who it was. The figure was her. Her own reflection, twisted, distorted, and somehow wrong, stood watching her, a smile frowning on its lips, one that was both familiar and terrifying. The eyes those were the same eyes. Her eyes. "You shouldn't have come back." The figure's voice was low, raspy, an echo of her own, but twisted and unnatural. Ellen staggered backward, her chest tight, her head swimming. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up. The figure before her began to move, stepping slowly toward her, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching out of proportion. Its shadows seemed to flicker and stretch with it, as though it were part of the room, part of the walls themselves. And then, the shadow spoke. "This place is not just a house. It is a memory, an echo of the forgotten, a place where things are trapped, where things wait for you." The air was thick with an oppressive force, a presence that was older than time itself. Ellen felt her breath become shallow, her body growing cold as the figure drew closer. "You think you can leave. You think you can escape, but there is no leaving the forgotten. There is no escaping what you've opened." Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The figure bent down, its smile widening, its fingers long and thin, reaching for her. "You belong here now. This is your place. This is your truth." Ellen screamed, her voice breaking the silence that had enveloped the room. But as she did, the walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows swallowing her whole. The figure loomed over her, its grin widening, and as it reached for her, she knew it was too late. Ellen awoke with a jolt, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The air was thick and suffocating, the room around her pitch black. She couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except her own breath, shallow and ragged. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against cold stone. Her head pounded, and she tried to push herself up, but the ground beneath her was soft, like the earth itself had swallowed her. She fought to stand, but her legs were unresponsive, heavy with the weight of something unseen. And then, as if emerging from the shadows, a voice spoke, again louder, clearer this time. "You cannot escape. You belong here." The whispering grew louder, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. Panic surged through Ellen as she tried to move, tried to find an exit, but the room had no end. It was a maze. No matter how far she ran, the walls stretched further, and the shadows seemed to follow her. With a burst of strength, she forced her way to her feet, her vision blurred, but through the dim haze, she could make out the door once more, standing far in the distance, as though waiting for her. She bolted toward it, her heart racing. The shadows reached for her, the walls clawing at her as if trying to drag her back. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The door swung open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ellen saw daylight, a breath of fresh air, free of the thick, suffocating presence of the house. She had to get out. She had to leave, before the house pulled her back in. But just as she reached the threshold, a cold, skeletal hand grabbed her wrist, dragging her back. Ellen screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness that surrounded her, the shadows closing in as they pulled her deeper into the room. "You will never leave. The forgotten will always be with you." If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.